One of the best projects that OWASP has is the Top 10 project, which lists the top 10 vulnerabilities of contemporary web applications. If you're at all aware of web security, nothing on the list is going to be surprising. Now, the 2013 version of the list is the latest edition, and it marks the 10th anniversary of the project. The first release was in 2003, with minor updates in 2004 and 2007. And then the 2010 list was revamped to prioritize the list by risk, rather than simply prevalence as in the earlier versions. And the 2013 edition uses that same approach. So the list is a list of priorities. Worst first. So the Top 10 list is designed to be a powerful awareness document for web application security. The list represents a broad consensus of OWASP members about what the most critical web application security flaws are today. Project members include a variety of security experts from around the world who have shared their expertise to produce the list. And here's a quote from OWASP. Quote, "We urge all companies to adopt this awareness document within their organization and start the process of ensuring that their web applications do not contain these flaws. Adopting the OWASP Top 10 is perhaps the most effective first step towards changing the software development culture within your organization into one that produces secure code." End quote. And that's pretty wise advice. Now, the Top 10 list is free to use. It's licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 3.0 license. And that means you can copy it, distribute it, transmit the work, and you can adapt it, use it commercially, all provided that you attribute the work and, if you do change it, that you distribute the resulting work only under the same or similar license to that one. Okay, so I think it's probably pretty unlikely that unless you just copy it wholesale and put your own name on it, which most people are going to recognize that, that you can use it, you can transmit it, you can adapt it internally, create your own documents from it, and so forth. It's a very liberal kind of a license. And we can thank Laurie Lessig for his work on Creative Commons. All right, so the list is not just a list. For each web security risk on the list, it provides a description of the risk, example vulnerabilities, example attacks, guidance on how to avoid the risk, and references to other resources, both from OWASP and outside the organization. And you'll see all of those as I introduce each of the risks that I cover in this course. Now, the list is worthy of careful study, so you can explore and thoroughly, deeply understand the concepts. Only then can you avoid the risks and proactively protect against them in your web applications. Okay, so let's talk about the 2013 Top 10 list. Keep in mind that OWASP updates the list every 3 or 4 years roughly, so we're probably getting close to them starting work on the next version. All right, but in the 2013 list, the first is injection. So this includes all kinds of injection flaws. Probably the biggest one you've heard of is SQL injection, but there's various other kinds as well. This sort of risk occurs when untrusted data is sent to an interpreter as part of a command or query. Another way of saying that is that data is treated as commands that are executed. And so the result is that the attacker's data can trick the interpreter, whatever treating that data as code, into executing unintended commands or accessing data without proper authorization. Second risk is broken authentication and session management. The idea here is that application functions related to authentication and session management are often not implemented correctly, and that allows attackers to compromise passwords, keys, or session tokens, or to exploit other implementation flaws to assume other users' identities. Third one is cross-site scripting. You no doubt have heard about that. It's a very obnoxious kind of a risk. So cross-site scripting happens when an application takes untrusted data. In fact, you might be starting to see a theme here. Untrusted data is a big problem. But in cross-site scripting, it sends it to a web browser without proper validation or escaping. So this attack lets attackers execute scripts in the victim's browser, which can hijack user sessions, deface websites, or redirect the user to malicious sites. And a real bad one is when the hostile script gets stored in a database and then it's treated as executable code by other web pages. All right, A4 is insecure direct object references. This happens when a developer exposes a reference to an internal implementation object, things like files or directories or database keys, and does it without an access control check or other kinds of security protections, which means that attackers can manipulate those references to access unauthorized data. The fifth risk in order of priority is security misconfiguration. Good security requires having a secure configuration that's defined and deployed for the application. Frameworks, application server, web server, database server, and the platform. The entire stack that the web application is running on top of. So secure settings need to be defined, implemented, and maintained. Most importantly, maintained, because this is the sort of thing that you can't just set and forget about. And you also have to be careful about defaults, because the defaults are often insecure. Vendors of various products are getting better about that, but you can't count on defaults being secure. And also an issue is keeping software up to date. Next risk is sensitive data exposure. The problem here is that a lot of web applications don't properly protect sensitive data. Things like credit cards or tax IDs, authentication credentials, birth dates, home addresses, and so forth. And that means that attackers can steal or modify the weakly protected data in order to conduct credit card fraud, identity theft, and various other crimes. And this risk deals both with the insecurity of data when it's at rest, say in a database or some other files on a web server, as well as when it's in motion, when it's being transmitted across the network. Next up is missing function level access control. Now, most of the time, web applications verify function level access rights before making that functionality visible within the UI. But applications need to perform that same kind of access control checks on the server when each function is accessed. If you don't do that kind of verification, then attackers will be able to forge requests in order to access different features without the authorization that you otherwise build into your website. Another really onerous attack is cross-site request forgery. This kind of attack forces a logged-on victim's browser to send a forged HTTP request, including the victim's session cookie for, say, a bank site, and any other automatically included information to a vulnerable web application. And that way, the attacker can force the victim's browser to generate requests the vulnerable application thinks are legitimate requests from the victim. This has been a big one recently. It's very hard to protect against, which is a big problem. All right, ninth on the list is using components with known vulnerabilities. Not quite sure why you would ever do this, knowingly anyway. The idea here is that web applications consist of a large number of components, libraries, frameworks, other software modules, almost all of them running with full privileges. And they're coming from different sources. Some you probably develop yourself, but you may also buy third-party packages or use open source software. If an attacker exploits a vulnerable component, that can cause serious data loss or even taking over the entire server. So if you have an application that's otherwise secure, but you use components with known vulnerabilities, then it can undermine the entire application. And that can cause a whole range of attacks and impacts. And then the final item on the list is unvalidated redirects and forwards. Web applications very often redirect and forward users to other pages and websites, and use untrusted data to determine the destination pages. So if you don't use proper validation, then attackers can redirect victims to phishing or malware sites, or use forwards to access unauthorized pages. All right, so that's the entire 2013 Top 10 list. Hopefully you're familiar with at least some of the items on the list, but you really need to be generally familiar with them all, so that you can avoid building them into your own applications. But even just the list alone is worth studying. if only to make sure that you're aware of the worst web vulnerabilities that are currently plague the web. So again, these are current as of 2013. But OWASP goes well beyond the list. The website has lots of information about each of these vulnerabilities. Its background, how it affects the security of sites, various attack scenarios so you can really understand how the attack happens, and lots of references for what to do about the problem. One nice thing about the list is that it cuts across all web technologies with technology-neutral resources. So it's great for learning about the vulnerabilities that can affect all websites, no matter how they're written, what operating systems they run on, what development tools they're built with, whatever. But that's also kind of a problem. Coming to the list as an ASP.NET developer, or any other web technology, Java server pages, Ruby on Rails, whatever, it can be hard to figure out exactly how the vulnerability applies to the technologies that you're using. The list cuts across all technologies, and sometimes an item on the list relates to implementation features, other times about how the features are used. It's important to understand that the list is going to continue to change. Even without changing a single line of your application code, you might become vulnerable as new flaws are discovered and attack methods are refined. So what it means is, forewarned is forearmed. All right, so here's the top 10 list once again. The items in red were part of the first course in the series of courses from LearnNowOnline. My colleague, Mike Benkovich, covered those items in his course. In that course, for injection, Mike really focused on SQL injection, but the concept is the same in any programming language. And then in addition to these vulnerabilities, he also covered integer overflow, which is a very specific kind of programming mistake that can provide an entry point into the application for an attacker. All right, then this is the list of vulnerabilities that I'm going to cover in this course. So I'm going to cover A2, 5, 6, and 7. Now, throughout this course, I'm going to be using a consistent terminology to discuss application risks. According to the OWASP Top 10, the characterization of a risk or a vulnerability is that, quote, attackers can potentially use many different paths through your application to do harm to your business or organization. Each of these paths represent a risk that may or may not be serious enough to warrant attention, end quote. All right, so this image is from OWASP's CISO, or Chief Information Security Officer, AppSec Guide, Criteria for Managing Application Security Risks. It provides a framework for examining risks and their impacts. OWASP uses this as a framework for exploring the top 10 risks, and I'll follow their lead in this course. Now, sometimes these paths are trivial to find and exploit, and sometimes they're extremely difficult. Similarly, the harm that's caused may be of no consequence, or it may put you out of business. To determine the risk to your organization, you can evaluate the likelihood associated with each threat agent, attack vector, and security weakness, and combine it with an estimate of the technical and business impact to your organization. Together, those factors determine the overall risk of a vulnerability. Okay, so the idea in this chart is that you have threat agents. That's what OWASP calls attackers or hackers. And then there's different attack vectors. What little chinks in the security armor are available within an application that an attacker can take advantage of in order to get access to your application? So once they find a chink, they can use that to exploit a security weakness. So this is where the top 10 list comes in. And that often involves bypassing security controls. That's kind of how the weakness comes into play. And then they have access to have various technical impacts, accessing functions or different assets, different database, different data, whatever it might be. And that in turn has different business impacts. The exposure of data, the exposure of some functionality, the complete takeover of a server, whatever the end result might be. So that's, again, the general framework that the top 10 list uses in their analysis of the different risks. Okay, here I am back in the OWASP homepage. And I want to go to the top 10 list. And there's a lot of different ways to get to it, but this is a convenient way to get to it. And here's where you can find information about the top 10 list. In case you had any doubts whether or not this is a flagship project of OWASP, right there. It's a mature project. It's been around for more than 10 years now. And here's a general description of the project. I just want to point out a couple things here. The two right sidebars here. So you have a brief description of what the top 10 list is all about, project leader, various related projects. As you can see, there's a separate mobile top 10 risks. There's a top 10 cheat sheet, which is a quick and easy reference. Maybe post that on your wall. And various other resources that you can explore. So it's really nice that they have the list available as a PDF as well. So you can download that. That actually has slightly different information. It's mostly some different summaries that you can just scroll through rather than clicking around a lot. So whatever is most convenient for you. But largely it is a duplicate of what's on the website. So if I go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, so this is the PDF version of the 2013 list. There's the WASP, of course. And as you can see, it has a lot of information about the list and OWASP itself. Acknowledgements of who worked on it. This is a nice, interesting section. It's what's changed from 2010 to 2013. So there's a general description, but what's really helpful is this down here. Is if you're comparing the list, this compares. So as you can see, injection reigns top, which kind of indicates a problem. We're just not getting better at injection. It's still the most prevalent and biggest risk of web applications out on the web. And pretty much the same thing for the other five lists. Here we've had a little bit of shaking up. We've had a couple of items merge with A9 into sensitive data exposure. So insecure cryptographic storage, which is data at rest, was merged with insufficient transport layer protection, which is data in motion. And that's the new sensitive data exposure. Okay, this item was broadened into missing function level access control. Cross-site request forgery is a perennial favorite. Here's one that was added to another item. And then using unvalidated redirects and forwards remains the 10th item. Okay, and so then after that, there's that overall flow that I talked about. And then it explains some of the information about the methodology. And then it comes to a quick summary of each of the items. And then finally, a page for each of the risks itself. So this is that kind of flow through from threat agents to the business impacts. Brief description. Some guidance in whether or not you're vulnerable to the injection. How do you prevent it? Some example attack scenarios. And then the best part, which is all of these references, both to OWASP materials as well as some external items. Okay, so you have a lot of resources that you have access to in order to solve problems and mitigate these vulnerabilities. Okay, so if I go down away past all these, you go through all 10. And then some information about what's next. What sort of things do you need to do in order to produce secure web applications? And a big part of security is validation or verification. So there's information, and OWASP also has lots of additional information for verifiers, the people who need to verify the security of a web application. So there's some guidance here in the context of the top 10 list. For organizations, how you can develop an organization that develops secure web applications, and some steps you need to take. Some information about risks and risk factors and combinations of things, and information about the copyright on this document. Okay, so a lot of really good information there. Okay, and then you can also go to the Top 10 2013 Wiki. Oh, and by the way, there's also an email list that you can join for notifications for participating in the development of the next list. As I record this, there's really no activity on that list because they're not yet gearing up. But I anticipate as time progresses, there'll be a lot more activity. Okay, so here is the top 10 for 2013 list. So this has a page and general information. Okay, so let me go back to, no, actually this is getting into the meat of things. Let me back up. Okay, this is the tab where I wanted. Okay, so the first thing to notice here is once again you have a link to that PDF and to the wiki. Again, the wiki contains most of what's in the PDF and vice versa. And as you can see, there's also a lot of different translations. So OWASP volunteers have been very active in translating it to make it as available and widely available as possible. Okay, then there's a couple of PowerPoint presentations followed by a link to data about each of the individual risks. What's interesting here is that they're very open about the top 10 list development methodology. So I don't want to dwell on the details here, but this talks about how they developed the list. So as you can see, there's a number of steps, so forth. But what's interesting in all this is that the list is based on 8 data sets from 7 different firms that specialize in application security. Those include 4 consulting companies and 3 tool or software as a service vendor. And the data spans 500,000 vulnerabilities across hundreds of organizations and thousands of applications. So the way they select the items on the top 10 list and how they prioritize them is based on that prevalence data, in combination with a consensus estimate of the exploitability, detectability, and the impact estimates. So it starts with raw data based on attacks on websites, and then is distilled down into the top 10 risks by a consensus by the members of this project. Okay, so as you can see, there's all kinds of different resources, so you can really explore these, and if you want to get deep into these vulnerabilities and really understand how they came about, this is the place to get the information. Okay, go back to page. All right, so there's some additional information, and here's a brief list of the changes between 2010 and 2013. The idea here is that the list responds to the changing landscape of web security threats over time. So this is a current list, current as of 2013 anyway. So you can be pretty confident these are real risks and vulnerabilities of your web applications. Okay, so I kind of glossed over this. If we take a quick look at what's on each of these pages, you can see that you have an overall flow using that methodology that I explained. And just like the PDF page, has all of these links and basic information where you can get more information about the particular risk, including the references. This is a valuable part of the top 10 list. Okay, come back over to this page. Notice that you have a ready link for the top 10 for 2010, so you can explore that if you want to really get into the changes. This discusses the translation efforts and gives a shout out to the people involved in the translations. Project details. This is the who, what, and how of the project. So if you want to get more involved, this is the place to do it. It has links to the release leader and various information. And then the final tab is some commercial and OWASP uses of the top 10. I don't find this is particularly up to date. I think it's much more widespread now, but it's probably a part of the wiki that just isn't kept quite as up to date. But the one that I really enjoy is NSA. In their Developer Guidance on Web Application Security. Probably the single biggest organization that attacks the web and makes us less safe, pushes the top 10 for we developers to make our web applications safer. So you can go to this link, and kind of unfortunately, it really doesn't take you, at least the last time, it doesn't take you to any place useful, just to a search page that really doesn't have any information about the top 10 list. If you do search for OWASP top 10, there's really nothing all that specific. But as you delve around, there's a web application security overview and web application security vulnerabilities document. Those are kind of interesting, if you have any shred of trust left in the NSA anymore. but unfortunately it's kind of dated information. So kind of no surprise there. All right, so lots of information about the top 10 list, lots of resources for each of the risks and vulnerabilities.